So periodization refers to how training stacks over time. So another way to think about this is stacking or sequencing. So when we say periodization, we're referring to the way that we sequence different periods of training that make up an entire training block or even multiple training blocks. Now this is a highly requested topic for me to explain because there are different strategies when it comes to this P word. But the two main methods here that I'll dive into in a bit refer to either gradually building volume over time or gradually building intensity over time. Now, to build fitness in the long run, we need to increase the stimulus that our body is exposed to because we only grow when we're challenged, we only grow when we're exposed to new stimulus that we have not adapted to before. And the way that we sequence when and where we're getting volume versus intensity are the main variables that we think about when we're thinking about how to periodize or sequence training. Now, this is just one framework to think about how we structure training. There are many others out there, but it is the backbone of a lot of the training philosophies out there, no matter if you're using a Higdon or a Hansen or a Daniel. All of these different strategies rely on the tactical sequencing of workouts, of weeks, of mileage, so that we can get to the end of a training block race ready, having developed those specific fitness factors that we need to increase in order to hit a certain goal time or to race a distance well. So in this video, I'm going to dive into what periodization is. I'll explain 4 different models for this. I'll explain the different units of time that we can use when we're thinking about how to periodize or sequence training. And I'm going to end with 3 takeaways from the philosophy of periodization that you can implement into your training starting today. Most of the insights that I'm going to bring to you today are directly from this book, Running Periodization: Training Theories to Run Faster by Dr. Jason Karp. So if you have any questions on the material I'm going to present today, please drop them below. I will dig through this book to answer your questions. There's also tons of great studies in here, so I can dig into some of the data. If that's something you guys are interested in, just drop a comment or a question below, and I'd be happy to get to that for you. All right, guys, let's get into it. So when we think about the P word, at the root of this word is the word period. Now, the reason we're using this word period and what it means in this philosophy of training is that different periods will sequence over time in order to get to our end goal. Now, there are 4 main methods of periodization, and the 2 most popular are linear and reverse linear. So we'll start with linear periodization. What linear periodization refers to is the gradual building of intensity over time. So we start with a high volume of training and a low intensity, and as we progress through a training block, we reach a higher intensity of training and a lower volume. Now, this was popularized in the Soviet Union, and it hasn't been validated through studies, but it has been validated by the success of athletes. In a linear periodization program, you start with a phase of aerobic base building, of aerobic training, which is going to be a higher volume period of training. And then you'll gradually ease down that aerobic emphasis and scale up some of those other fitness factors, namely that intensity, that faster running, as we get closer to a race. So in this style of periodization, there are 3 main training periods within that block. So first you have the general preparation phase. That's where you're gonna be doing a lot of that aerobic base building. Then you have the specific preparation phase. So you target the intensity of whatever that training program is gonna be towards the goal race. Third, you have the competition phase. So if you're a cross-country runner or a college runner, you'll likely be racing for a month or 2. If you are a marathon runner and a recreational runner, you probably only have 1 goal race of the season. So that competition phase would be much shorter than a high school or college runner. And finally, the last phase after those initial 3 phases are complete is the recovery and transition phase. That's when you ease off the volume and intensity entirely, scale it back down, allow the body to recover before diving back into a general preparation phase once again. A lot of the popular training programs that we think about today, like a Daniels or a Higdon or a Hansen, share some characteristics with linear periodization in that we do have that general preparation phase of strong aerobic base building, but the difference is for most of these programs, we're not easing down on the volume over time. Rather, we're scaling up volume and scaling up intensity as we get into that specific preparation phase. So the second common type of periodization is reverse linear periodization. So this is a system where you start with a high intensity of training and you decrease that intensity over time. So in the context of endurance running, of marathon training, you might start with some fast anaerobic power workouts, so running faster than 5K pace. Then as you get toward the end of that program, you'll be doing longer, bit slower reps. Now, research has shown that athletes who go through this style of training have found that those longer, slower workouts at the end of a training block are perceived as easier because of that faster, higher intensity work that came first. So the most common principle from reverse linear periodization that you might be familiar with is the idea of training speed first and then endurance later. So whereas we are going to have that aerobic base building period in most of the common training plans like a Daniels, a Higdon, or a Hansen, there also might be some emphasis on speed in the earlier parts of the training program. For example, doing strides, doing hill sprints. And as we get later into the training program, we emphasize endurance more, so doing marathon pace reps, doing those longer threshold style workouts. So as you can see, a lot of the popular training programs share some elements of all of these periodization models, but it's not going to be a one size fits all or an exact match of the textbook definition of each of these periodization styles. Now, before I get into the next two styles of periodization, I want to take a detour really quick to introduce some new language that can help us frame the next part of the discussion. So, as we were thinking about a training cycle and the different elements within it, one of the things that we can play with is time. There are three main units of time that we think about when structuring a training block. And so those are the macro cycle, the mesocycle, and the microcycle. So a macro cycle, you can think about this as 3 to 6 months. This is the entirety of a training block. So if you're gonna be training for Boston in April and it's November right now, you have 5 months until that goal race. Therefore, the macro cycle is 5 months. One unit down from that, the shorter element of time that builds into the macro cycle is the mesocycle. So we can think about this as 1 month or one mini cycle within that greater training block. So if we're thinking about a base building phase, for example, that's a month long. That would be one mesocycle. Then we move on to a speed phase. That would be another mesocycle. Maybe that's 4 to 6 weeks. So those mesocycles are the units within that macro cycle that make up the training program. Finally, the smallest unit of time within a training block when we're thinking about periodization is the microcycle. And this is the shortest unit of time in which we're getting one series of programming in. So if we're working on a 7-day training cycle, then the microcycle would be 1 week. There's different philosophies out there. For example, I know Kofuzi did a video last year about why he uses a 9 to 10-day training cycle. So in that case, the microcycle would be 9 to 10 days. For most of us, we can think about the microcycle as that 1 week. That's the 7 days in which we're going to be repeating a series of workouts every week. So we're going to have the long run on the same day of those 7 days. We're going to have our tempo workout on the same day of those 7 days. And that's what makes up that microcycle. All right, now getting back to the third theory of periodization, which is block periodization. So block periodization is the style of sequencing in which we focus on different fitness factors within each mesocycle of the macrocycle or the training block. So what that means is if we have a 3 to 4 month training block, a 3 to 4 month macrocycle, for each month of that macro cycle, so for each mesocycle, we're gonna focus on a different system of the body. We're gonna be optimizing for a different element of our fitness. What that could mean is, hey, month 1, we're working on aerobic power. Month 2, we're working on anaerobic power, we're working on speed. Month 3, we're working on specific race, marathon, half marathon endurance. So this is a more advanced system of periodization. This works better for elite and advanced athletes. There is a risk here that you can detrain some of those fitness factors that aren't being used all the time. In contrast to a system like a Higdon, a Hansen, or a Daniel, where you're doing a long run, a tempo run, an interval workout, all in the same week, you're working different fitness factors, you're engaging different systems of your body, aerobic and anaerobic, and getting those neuromuscular coordinations to be firing off. This is a system where you're only going to be working on maybe slow twitch for 1 month, fast twitch for the next month. You're not going to be rounding yourself out as a runner. So for newer runners, this isn't the best way to sequence a training program, but for more advanced runners, for Olympians, for runners who've been doing this for a long time, this can introduce new stimulus. This can introduce a new environment for the body to adapt to. So it does have some benefits if you have been running for a while. All right, guys, the fourth and final type of periodization that I want to address here today is undulating periodization. So if you're familiar with Latin, the root of undulating is undu, which in Latin means wave. So this is a system of periodization where the training looks like a wave. The volume and intensity is going up and down on a very frequent basis. It could be a weekly basis or a daily basis. So what this style of training is going to do is it's going to throw a bunch of different stimuli at you on a weekly or a daily basis, force your body to adapt to different stimulus all the time, so you're working on different fitness factors nearly every day, and you're not going to be getting stagnant. It's the complete opposite of block periodization, where you're working on only one fitness factor at a time. Now, if we think about the way that most popular marathon training programs are structured, there is an element of undulating periodization in there, in which every day we're working on a different fitness factor. But the difference here is the volume stays pretty consistent week over week, and the intensity of those varying workouts are roughly the same from week to week. We're gradually increasing the intensity maybe as we're building towards that race specific phase. So again, this is a system of training that's going to be best for more advanced athletes who have years of training under their belt and need to take some different approaches to force adaptations in their body, which will lead to those increases in fitness. So based on my learnings from this book and some research I've done and all of the great studies that Dr. Karp cites in here, the main takeaway is that there have been tons of studies on periodization, specifically for strength training, also for cycling. There haven't been as many for running, but the biggest thing is that none are conclusive as to which model is best. Now, that is probably a disappointing answer, but the positive thing about it is that it shows you can take different approaches to training and still increase fitness, because in most of these cases, in most of these studies that Dr. Karp cited, the athletes did improve their 5K time or their time trial time on the bike after using one of these different models. There was slightly, maybe a 4% increase for this group versus 7% increase for this group that used this different system. But it shows that if we're introducing new stimuli to our body, forcing it to adapt, we are going to improve our fitness. So with that, I want to leave you with 3 takeaways, 3 things that we can learn from these periodization models that we can implement into our training today to make us better runners over the long term. So the first thing here is increase volume over time. That is the biggest takeaway from every running book I've read, every running study I've read, every anecdotal piece of evidence I've looked at out there. If you look at Eliud Kipchoge, look at Seth James Damore, look at your own training, right? As you increase volume over time, this has been backed by studies, this has been backed by race performances, you will improve your fitness. That's the best thing we can do as recreational runners. If you're running 40 miles a week today, gradually build up to 60, 70 miles per week next year if you want to improve your race performances. Now, if we're thinking about periodization and the context of a macro cycle where you have this one training block, maybe your peak this training block is going to be 60 miles. What you should do then is within the next few macro cycles, within the next 9 months to a year, within each macro cycle, increase that peak mileage 10 to 20% until you get to that next comfortable level to build your fitness. That's going to be the best thing we can do as endurance runners, because that aerobic fitness is the #1 fitness factor for us. Distance running is inherently an aerobic event, and the best thing we can do to increase aerobic fitness is to run more. All right, the second takeaway from this periodization research is don't get injured, right? With increasing volume over time, the corollary to that is we need to be healthy. So we need to reach a safe and healthy level of volume that our body can handle. That's one of the big learnings from the linear periodization model that I took away. There's that recovery and transition phase baked in right in there to the way that they're sequencing and periodizing those linear training systems. So you have the general preparation phase, the specific preparation phase, the race phase, and then the transition and recovery phase. And that 4th phase is super important. After we hit those races, after you get your marathon PR, you got to ease off the volume for at least 1 to 4 weeks, letting your body rebuild however much time it takes. There's been studies out there that show you get muscular damage for up to a month to 3 months after racing a marathon. So the longer the race, the more recovery and transition you're going to need before diving into the next macro cycle. The third and final takeaway from periodization that I have for you is to add race-specific training in where relevant. Now, if we're staying healthy, if we're increasing our volume over time, we're going to be able to race, and we're going to be able to race well. But to maximize our race performances, we need to be doing training that's specific to our races and also specific to our weaknesses as athletes. Now, in the Hanson's Marathon book, which is one of my favorite running books that I've read, they have a big emphasis on speed work. And they also talk a lot about how the athletes that they coach who have run 4 to 5 marathons in the past few years are deeply lacking in speed because, as you know, and as I mentioned, aerobic fitness is the biggest element to success in these distance running events. So a lot of runners think, okay, if I'm doing a long run, if I got my weekly volume up to 70 to 100 miles a week, I'm straight, I'm good to run marathons. What that means is we're neglecting one of those fitness factors, that anaerobic speed, maybe even that aerobic power, running at VO2 max, maximizing the way that our body uses oxygen and blood, pumps blood into the muscles. And so we've detrained one of the key systems, not as key as aerobic, but we've detrained some of the key systems in our body that allow us to execute well on race day. So if you're a newer runner, that means race-specific training for you might just be doing long runs. If you're a more advanced runner, that race-specific training to perform well at the half marathon or marathon could be incorporating more speed work into your training where relevant. Now, speed work is like hygiene. It's like brushing your teeth. It's something that all runners should be doing on a weekly basis. You should have some sort of stimulus in there where you're firing, you're getting that quick turnover, you're working either VO2 max or anaerobic power, something that's gonna get you running faster than an aerobic pace. And that's not something that we're all doing all the time, but it's something that we should be doing specifically as we're building toward a goal race. All right, guys, so there you have it. That was my best attempt at explaining this 6-syllable training concept simply. Please leave a comment below. I'm gonna be on a tear with these training videos. Also, let me know which training topic you want me to explain simply next. I got a big stack of books. I have Lydiard, I have Fitzinger, I have Hansen, I have Higdon, I have Daniel. I got everybody in the house. Let me know which one of these guys you want me to dig into next and what you want to learn about. As always, thank you for watching, thank you for liking and subscribing, and I will see you tomorrow.